That's not how the ancient Israelites understood it at all. Okay, the book of Genesis was to them not an isolated individual book. It was part of a larger, comprehensive narrative that spanned the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Think of it sort of, if you're familiar with like the Lord of the Rings, the story of the Lord of the Rings, which is one coherent narrative released in 3 individual stories. Same thing with the book of Genesis. And so the book of Genesis is the book of Genesis is part of a larger narrative that is telling a very specific and coherent narrative or story. And that is the story of God's formation of the nation of Israel and his establishment of his covenant with them, and then his calling of them out of Egypt and into the promised land. That is the story that the Pentateuch is telling. It's the story of the people of Israel and their formation and where they have come from and where God has brought them out of. And Genesis chapters 1 through 11 function as a sort of prologue to that story. Those chapters are the setting of the stage, as it were, for what leads to and necessitates the calling of Israel and the formation of Israel. Right? That is what 1 through 11 are essentially all about. And to review in setting up, I'm just going to try to review very, very quickly here, and to review in setting up the call of Abram and what goes on in those first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Those chapters begin in Genesis 1 through 2 with the story of God's creation and ordering of the cosmos. And the pinnacle of that creative process, the pinnacle of that ordering, is the creation of humanity, who is created to partner with God in bringing order to the creation, to partner with God in filling the creation, to act as God's image in the world. That's what humanity is created to do, to act as God's image in the world for the purpose, ultimately, of being conformed to God's likeness, to being made like God. That's Genesis 1 and 2. Humanity, by its own chosen disobedience, fails in that purpose. And so what we then get in chapters 3 through 11, leading up to the call of Abram, is a series of falls or catastrophes. That's what goes on. Where in these subsequent falls, this series of falls or catastrophes that happens, we see humanity becoming subject to 3 significant problems, 3 enemies: death, sin, and the evil spiritual powers. Okay? And Genesis chapter 11 ends now with the Tower of Babel incident. It ends with the Tower of Babel, and so humanity is now scattered. The nations have been scattered, and humanity is separated from God. And that then leads into the story of the calling of Abram. Because God forms Israel, which he describes in Deuteronomy 32 as a nation for myself. That's what he calls them. He says, I called you and formed you a nation for myself. We've seen the scattering of the nations in Genesis chapter 11. Now God is going to call and form a nation for himself. And he forms Israel as the means by which he is going to deal with those problems that came into the creative realm in chapters 1 through 11. That is, Israel is the means by which he is going to deal with the problems of death, of sin, and the evil spiritual powers, so that he can restore humanity to its original created purpose. And the forming of Israel begins with the calling of the man Abram. That's where it starts. To whom, in chapter 12, God makes a series of promises, and with whom later on, he sets up his covenant and extrapolates upon those promises. And all of these promises that God makes to Abram in chapter 12 and the ones he makes elsewhere in other portions in Genesis, all of them are finally and ultimately fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. He, Jesus Christ, is the reason Abram is called, so that a people can be formed with whom God can dwell, through whom the Theotokos, the Mother of God, can come and can then, through whom God himself can become incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ to defeat death, to defeat sin, to defeat the evil spiritual powers, to bring scattered humanity back to God, and so that humanity can fulfill its original destiny. That is why Abram is called, to enable this to happen. So, our introduction to Abram, even though I've been talking about Genesis 12, it actually comes in at the very, very tail end of chapter 11. That's where we meet Abram for the very first time. We actually have his genealogy of where he came from. And in verse 31 it says, "Now Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and he led them out of Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran, and they dwelt there." So, Abram goes with his family, with his father, out of Ur of the Chaldeans. And Ur is where his story starts, as it were. Now, a little bit of context and background so we know where Abram came from. Ur was not just any city. Ur is one of the oldest known cities to exist in the world. As best we can tell, it was founded sometime around 3300 to 3500 BC. In fact, it's so old that its name, Ur, in Sumerian, literally just is the word for city. I mean, it's just city. I mean, that's how old. There weren't very many other cities about at this time. It's that old. And it was part of the Sumerian civilization. The Sumerian civilization was the dominant, a little bit too organized to call it a kingdom, but it's the dominant civilization that exists in Mesopotamia. This is south-central modern-day Iraq. So you have the Persian Gulf, and splitting up off the Persian Gulf are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which run sort of in a northwesterly direction. If you take that middle swath of land that extends up from the Persian Gulf, in between the Tigris and Euphrates, kind of bending off to the northwest towards the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, that is the region of Mesopotamia. And the lower half of that is the kingdom of Sumer. And the kingdom of Sumer was the ascendant and dominant civilization in the Middle East from about 4500, perhaps as late as 5000 BC, up till about 1800 BC. Okay, America's not even been around 250 years. This is a civilization that lasted for near 3,000. All right, and Ur is the most dominant and significant city in that kingdom, in that civilization. Abram lived in the city of Ur and would have lived around the year 2100 BC. So the time Abram has come along, the civilization he's a part of has been in existence more than 2,000 years. The city he's a part of has existed for like 1,300 years at this point. I mean, this is old. And the city of Ur was at this time the most prosperous, the most influential city on earth. This is a period which scholars actually call around 2100 BC. They call it the Sumerian Renaissance because the region was having a particular upshot in its influence. And the city of Ur in particular was the center of it all. That is where it was happening. It was a center of profound flourishing of the arts. It was economically very, very well off. Militarily, it was very, very strong. Its cultural influence is intense. So at this point in time, Ur is the strongest, it is the most innovative, it is the most culturally significant, it is the most cosmopolitan, the most wealthy city on the face of the earth. At the time, Abram is living there. And the religious cult of the city was built around the religious cult and worship of a moon god named Nano. And in the center of the city was a great ziggurat. I talked about ziggurats last week. And the ruins of the great ziggurat in the city of Ur still exist. They're in modern-day Iraq. They're about half the height they used to be. The great ziggurat at Ur, when it was completed, stretched about 210 feet into the air. And it was built in the time Abram lived there. Abram would have seen this thing go up. In fact, later on you get these other Jewish legends that are much, much later on. They're not canonical. They're not from any pseudo-canonical works, but there are these legends that exist of Abram being involved somehow and like walking about and seeing the building of the Tower of Babel. And it's just, these might be some sort of residual husk of a memory of something that goes on much further, because Abram would have been in Ur when the great ziggurat of that city went up. So this is the city. This is the city that Abram was a part of. His family would have been full participants in the worship of that particular, that pagan worship and idolatrous worship that was going on there. I don't say Abram was. I'll come back to that. But his family certainly would have been, and Scripture tells us as much. Joshua, in the book of Joshua, when he speaks to the children of Israel at one particular point, he reminds them, he says, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in the old times, and they served other gods. This is what Joshua tells them. And so this city, the greatest city on earth, this is like Paris and New York and Los Angeles and London, all mashed up into one, okay? Abram would have experienced there the absolute best and the greatest of what the civilization of his day had to offer. This is the city that Abram departs with his father, Terah, when he is called, and with his family. And it says at the end of verse 11, at the end of chapter 11, that they settled in Haran. Haran was a few hundred miles to the north of where the city of Ur was. And it's there in the city of Haran that chapter 12 opens. And I'm going to read just the first few verses of chapter 12. We're going to be covering down through, ultimately tonight, down through about verse 9. Now the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And in you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And then Abram departed as the Lord said to him, and Lot went with him. Now back in that first verse, now the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country. And then we're told, and so Abram departed. There is something very noteworthy about how this story is told right at the outset that we need to take note of. And it's noteworthy because of what is not in the record of this encounter between God and Abram. When you look at when God appears to people in the Old Testament, and particularly in the Pentateuch, for instance, when he appears to Jacob, when he appears later on to Moses, there is something of a pattern that you see, and that is that he appears, there's some type of manifestation or theophany of him, and when he appears, the person says, well, who are you? What is your name? And usually this is mingled with intense fear on their part as well. We see this also in the book of Judges when he appears to Gideon and in other places as well. But we see this type of interaction. Who are you? What is your name? We don't see anything like that in chapter 12. It's very much a cold open. All right. It just starts. Now the Lord said to Abram. And Abram's response is that he responds. He just simply responds, he obeys, and he does. Well, what this is a hint of something important. And it's that Abram, at this point in chapter 12, is already aware of, worshiping, has encountered Yahweh God. Because he doesn't have the type of response that we see elsewhere in the Pentateuch when God appears to people. And that's an important thing, because yes, the nations have departed, and there is no nation anymore who is faithfully following and worshiping Yahweh God. But there are individuals within the nations that are. Abram is one of them. We're going to meet another one in 2 chapters. If you keep on reading in the book of Genesis, 2 chapters over in Genesis chapter 14, Melchizedek is another. Someone from among the nations who is a faithful worshiper of Yahweh God. And so God gives, at the beginning of chapter 12, he gives Abram a command, and then he makes a series of promises of what he is going to do for Abram consequent to his obedience. He is to leave his home, It's the first thing. Get out of your country, from your kindred and from among your father's house. He is to leave his home, which at this point in the narrative is Haran. But at the same time, ultimately that home goes back to Ur, as is made clear elsewhere. In Genesis chapter 15, God speaks to Abram. He says, I am the Lord who called you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. Same thing over in Nehemiah chapter 9, I believe it is, where it's referred to, it says, the Lord called Abram out of Ur of the Chaldeans. And he is called to live now the life of a nomad. That's what Abram's called into. We are never going to see Abram again in the book of Genesis living in a city. He lives from this point on the life of a nomad. And to live the life of the nomad in this time, I need to say something about it. It's not like going camping. Like, that's not the life Abram is going out into. The world, in the ancient world, cities were the places of security. And in between the cities, it's wilderness and it's danger. I have a job where I oftentimes travel to cities in Kansas. And I'll pass through long stretches of open country, and it's nothing. This is not what life was like in the ancient world. There's no highway patrol, there's no state troopers, there's no type of coherent, organized thing. When you are outside, cities were walled structures at this time, and there was a reason they had walls in the ancient world. It was to keep the bad things out and to keep the people inside safe. And you go outside the city to travel, it was a dangerous prospect. It wasn't something that was simple or safe. Okay, so to get out of his country, to leave his home, to leave the city, to go out, not knowing where he's going. Get out of your country and into a land that I will show you, God says. This means that Abram is going to have to trust God alone for his security. It means he's going to have to trust God for his preservation now, because he is stepping out literally into the unknown. He also has to leave his family, the text says. Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house. This doesn't, okay, so we think of family as like mom, dad, and children. That's kind of our modern conception of family, what's oftentimes called the nuclear family. But that is the kind of dominant mode of family is in Western civilization only a few hundred years old as far as being the dominant model. In the ancient world, and this was the case also up into medieval and other times as well, but in the ancient world especially, your family was much bigger than that. Your family wasn't just mom, dad, and the kids. It also included the grandparents, usually a patriarch of the head of the family. It included aunts, it included uncles, it included cousins. It's a gaggle of people. That is what the family was. So when God is speaking about get out of your country and leave your family, that's the context in which he is talking about. That's why also the text makes note of the fact that when they leave Ur, it's Terah and it's Lot and it's Abram and it's a whole grouping of people. It's not just Abram and Sarah who go and who leave. Okay? Your family in this context was also, it was that which provided you security. It's that which told you who you were, where you came from. It's also that which gave you security for the future. Terah eventually is going to die, and Abram's going to assume as the oldest the role of sort of the family patriarch at this point. So to leave that, he's leaving his entire support structure for the present, his sense of identity of where he has come from, and he's leaving his source of security for the future as well. It's not a small thing. It's not like when I got done with high school and I packed up the car and I moved to Lawrence, Kansas to go to KU. And eventually I came back here and I bought my own house and I was on my own. This is not that. Okay? This is leaving everything that he knows. And there's a foreshadowing, I think, of Christ's own words when we look at what Abram is doing. Christ's words that one cannot love their family, their father, their mother, their children, their husband, their wife, more than him and be his disciple. There is a hint of that here. Certainly a foreshadowing of it. We think of the calling of James and John, the apostles, how they're sitting there mending their fishing nets. They're with their father, tending to the family business, because that's what they had, was a family fishing business. And they're tending to the nets. And the text says Jesus came and he called them and said, "Follow me." And the text says, and they left their nets and their father and followed him. Abram is our first example of something like this. Abram is our first example of the one who leaves all that he knows to follow the call, ultimately, of Christ. Verses 2 through 3 unpack what God is then going to do for Abram. It says, I will make of you a great nation. That means God is going to form a particular nation, a particular people who will come from Abram's descendants. I will make your name great. Now, remember the story that we talked about last week that went before this in chapter 11. It's the story of the Tower of Babel. In that story, you have the people who are engaging in this empire-building project, this attempt to make themselves a great nation, to make a name for themselves, the text says. And that's putting an end to that is put by God. So that's the story we have before, is this attempt on humanity's part, in a sinful way, to attempt to make themselves a great nation and make themselves a great name. But now here we have, in Genesis 12, following right on the heels of that, God is going to give Abram by grace what the Babel project builders sought to take by their own might. Okay? He is going to make Abram a great nation. He is going to make Abram's name great. And this is going to happen not because Abram was endeavoring to get this, not because Abram was grasping after it. That's what the Babel builders were doing. They were grasping after these things in a way that was emblematic and resembled the fall in Eden, where Eve grasped after the fruit wrongly, grasped after that rather than receiving it in God's timing. So Abram's not endeavoring to find these things, to make himself great. Rather, he receives these things from God. And God is the one who, in response to Abram's obedience, in response to his faithfulness, chooses to make Abram's name great, chooses to make of him a great nation. It's a very important parallel to see the text put that right next to the Babel story. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. The simple way to understand this is God is committing himself to Abram. That's what he's doing. He's committing himself to Abram. With regards to cursing, a little word of explanation is in order on that. Our English translations just have one word here. I will curse those who curse you. And in the Hebrew, it's actually two separate words that are used. And they each have slightly different meanings. What it's referring to when it says, those who curse you, it's referring to not to somebody who says mean things about Abram. It doesn't mean someone who uses bad words when they talk about Abram. It's very specifically the idea of those who speak or invoke words of evil power against Abram. Those who invoke words of evil power against Abram, God is saying, I will restrain them. I will prevent that. I will oppose those people who try to invoke evil against you and speak spiritual evil against you. I will oppose them. I will thwart them. In other words, God is promising to Abram, who has stepped out into the unknown, who has left all, who has left his home, he's left his family, he's left his father's household, his security, he's left all these things to follow God. God is saying to Abram, I will protect you. I will uphold you. I will be your security in this world of the unknown that you are going off into. Later on in Genesis chapter 15, we see this. God appears to Abram again, and the first thing he says to him when he appears to him again, he says, Abram, do not be afraid. I am your shield. That's essentially what is being communicated here as well. We know that sometimes Abram is, I'll mention this as well, Abram or not Abram, but God is sometimes called in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is where that begins, at least in history, from our perspective. This is where that begins. This is where God assumes that mantle, as it were. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is him committing himself to Abram. And by you, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So in other words, because of Abram and because of the nation that will come from him, all other nations, all other peoples on the earth will also be blessed. Now, as Christians, we're usually in such a hurry to run to the end of this, and what it means that sometimes we don't stop before that. Because at one level, this does point to the Israelite nation themselves. Okay? That they are a means by which God is a blessing to all the other nations. A number of different ways this is so. It's through the Israelite nation that God's law is revealed. It's through the Israelite people that the scriptures of the Old Testament were first given. It is through the Israelite people and their recorded history that we have a public record of God's activities in history, which are a revelation of his character, a revelation of his person. The Old Testament itself talks about this. That it says that God has revealed himself to the nations through Israel's own history. In the book of Joshua, Joshua's talking about everything that just happened over in Egypt and how they have conquered Pharaoh and they've walked out of there triumphant and victorious and they've crossed the Red Sea. And Joshua says that all of this was done so that all mankind will know that the hand of Yahweh is powerful. This was all done to testify to Yahweh's power before all the nations. And we see that happening because they pick up other people along the way who are clearly not ethnically related to Abram. Caleb is one of the most significant ones. Caleb and Joshua are the only two good spies. Caleb is not ethnically of Israel. He's a Kenizzite, which is one of the reasons why when they get to the Promised Land, Caleb kind of gets like the bad portion right on the edges of everything. And there are others as well. We see this in Rahab. When Rahab speaks to the spies who comes in, and she's like, help me because we've heard of all the things that your God is doing on the way here. And I want to join up with you. Okay? Even God's judgment on Israel for their failings to be faithful also acts as a revelation. The prophets talk about this repeatedly. Ezekiel, I'll just give you one example, Ezekiel 36, where it says that all of these things, even in their failings, when God judges them, it says that this is so that the nations will know that I am the Lord, when they see that I show myself holy through you before their eyes. So even in Israel's history, all right, the nations are in view and are blessed through them. But of course, the culmination, the apex, the pinnacle of this promise, and in you shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, is Jesus Christ. He is the ultimate fulfillment of this. Jesus Christ, in all aspects of his life and work, is the supreme revelation of who God is, what God is like. If we want to understand, what is God like? How does God feel towards us? We look at Jesus Christ. We look at the story of his life. He shows us who he is, whom Scripture calls the image of the invisible God. He is the culmination of these promises. In his death and his resurrection, he conquers, as I noted before, he conquers and he defeats sin, death, and the evil spiritual powers. Through his ascension, through his sending of the Holy Spirit, he makes possible the healing of fallen humanity. Through in the life of his church, and through its sacraments, baptism, chrismation, the Eucharist, confession, in these things, this is where all that Christ has done, all that he has accomplished in his life and work is applied to us in his church. He's made possible in all of this, Christ has, the restoration of humanity to its intended purpose. He's made possible that it should be restored to being conformed to the likeness of God. We sang something about this just tonight in the Paraclesis service. Eden has been open to all, was what we sang in here tonight. Eden has been open to all. Christ shall be born, raising the image which fell at the beginning. It is through Christ that all of this comes to pass, ultimately. Right? And the church, which is his body, proclaims the gospel of his victory in the world, calling all in and bringing in all the nations. Okay? So, Abram is the start of this great work. All of this, the restoration of humanity, and all that comes with that. Abram is the beginning of this. And again, it's hard not to see an echo here of things from the life of Christ. Christ speaks of the kingdom of heaven. It's like the small bit of leaven which goes in and it spreads and it leavens the whole lump. That's Abram. Starting here. It starts here. He's like the little seed, of the mustard seed, which Christ speaks of as a tiny seed which then grows into a great tree. Okay? Everything that God will do in and through Jesus Christ. Right? This is the start of when God is beginning, from our human temporal perspective, to work towards that. Okay? Also, I want to note something before moving on to chapter verses 4 through 9. God does not ask Abram to give up anything that he is not going to replace and enlarge himself. He calls Abram out of his home and out of his country, and he says he will give him a new one. He calls him to leave his family so that God might make of him a great nation out of his descendants. Right? He calls him out of the security of his father's household with the promise that God himself will be his security, that God will be his shield, that God will be his protection. And then again, you can't but hear an echo of the words of Christ when we look at it in that way as well. Christ who says that everyone who has left houses or children or brother or sister or father and mother for my sake or lands for my sake shall receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life. Again, Abram's our example. The first one who steps out and does that. Verses 4 through 9, Then Abram departed as the Lord said to him, and Lot went with him. And now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions, and every soul they acquired in Haran, and they departed for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan, and Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem as far as the oak of Moreh. And the Canaanites were then in the land. And then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, To your seed will I give this land. And there Abram built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. And so he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel. And he pitched his tent with Bethel to the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord. He called on the name of the Lord. And then Abram journeyed, going on still towards the Negev. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him. It is not sufficient for God to call Abram. Abram has to act. Abram has to respond. Abram has to make his free choice to obey the command that comes to him from God. This is part of why St. Paul is always looking back at Abram in his epistles. Abram stands as the great paradigm that the New Testament points us back towards often for the life of faith, which is obedient, responsive faithfulness. That's what faith is, obedient, responsive faithfulness. I was formed very deeply in a tradition that oftentimes tried to isolate the idea of faith as belief apart from faithfulness, as acting on that belief. And particularly when it came to Abram, we would come to passages like in Romans 4:3, where it talks about Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And we would say, see. So the important thing here is what sets Abram in order with God, we would say, is that he believes that it's true. And then later on, he acts on that. But what really sets him right with God is just first that he believes. And that it's the belief itself that sets him right with God. And we worked very, very hard to separate faith as belief from... it's not my phone. That's my ring, and I was freaking out. My phone is right here, so I don't know why I would be freaking out. Anyways, but we worked very, very hard to separate, to see these things as separate somehow. The thing is that faith and faithfulness are inseparable. Okay, you can't pull these things apart. Abram is distinguished from those around him in the ancient world, not because he has a set of deeply held theological convictions that are different from everybody else, and his theological convictions and beliefs about God are right, and their theological convictions and beliefs about the world of the deities is incorrect. That's not what separates Abram. That he has these different theological presuppositions that are correct, that are different from everybody else. What separates Abram from everybody else is that he believes in and worships Yahweh the Most High God, and he is faithfully obedient to him. All right? He is faithful in his obedience to the commands of Yahweh God. God comes to Abram and says, get out of your country. And Abram departs. Okay? God calls Abram to step away from everything that he knows. He has been in Ur for 75 years. He's a wealthy man. He's established there. He's secure. And God calls him and he says to get up, to leave all of that behind you, and go live as a nomad on the other side of your known world. Abram does. And Abram does. Okay? God doesn't tell Abram where he is sending him. He doesn't say, okay, I'm going to send you here first, and I'm going to do this, and by the way, I'm going to do... At least at the outset, God has just called him, and he says, get up, go, put your life in my hands, in essence. And Abram does it. This is why Abram is our great example of faith. This is why St. Paul says in Galatians, those who are, English translation has it, those who are of faith. A more literal rendering is those who are faithful. Those who are faithful are Abram's sons, St. Paul says. Those who are faithful are Abram's sons. Abram shows us, what does it look like to follow Jesus Christ? It's not a matter of simply believing that the right set of declarative theological propositions are true. That's not what it looks like to follow Jesus Christ. It is about living and walking in active obedience to him. There's a phrase, and I don't know if it originated with him or not, but the Protestant pastor, actually, Eugene Peterson, has described the Christian life in multiple places as best summed up as a long obedience in the same direction. And it's always stuck with me, and I think that's absolutely right. That is what the Christian life is. That is what it is to follow Jesus Christ, a long obedience in the same direction. Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice and they follow me. Who are his sheep? The ones who hear his voice and follow him. He says, he who hears my words and does them is the one who has built his house on the rock. Obedience comes first. Note this in the story of Abram. Obedience comes first, and God is going to reveal more to Abram later as he goes. All right? He's going to reveal things more progressively to Abram as we move through the book of Genesis. God reveals more and more and more. But it starts with Abram, get up, go. And Abram must follow that. And the same is true with us. Now, God's promises to Abram get fleshed out more in several places later that are worth looking at very briefly. Genesis 13, I'm going to read just a couple of verses there. Then God said to Abram, lift up your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, south, east, and westward. For all the land you see I will give you and your seed forever, and I will make your seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your seed could also be numbered. So here's one addition or fleshing out that he's saying, is that Abram's descendants are quantitatively going to be very, very great. That's what God is promising right there. He's going to make his descendants quantitatively innumerable. And then chapter 15 in one verse, verse 5. Then the Lord brought him outside and said to him, look now toward the heavens and count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to Abram, so shall your seed be. Now the wording here is very, very similar to what we just read. But there's a distinction. Okay? There's a distinction which the church fathers note about this passage in Genesis 15 in comparison to the one that we just read. Yes, there is again the implication of a great innumerable number of descendants. It says, look at the stars if you are able to number them. But there is also something more that is implied and that's being promised here. It's something that has to do with the stars. I need to say something here about kind of the ancient world and how they understood reality. In the ancient world generally, and particularly in ancient Judaism and throughout the Old Testament, the stars are seen always as linked to, emblematic of, angelic beings, small g gods, the semi-divine beings, the sons of God, who were the administrators of the created order. Job 38 is one of the places where this is most bluntly put. It speaks of the time of creation where the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy. And again, throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Old Testament, we come up frequently, again. There's dozens and dozens of times that the phrase, the heavenly host, is referred to. And in the Old Testament, that term, the heavenly host, was used to refer to both bodies that existed in the heavens, the sun, the moon, the stars. You see this in Genesis 2, and it talks about, thus were the heavens and all of their host finished. Psalm 33:6 does the same thing. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made and all of their host. And it's clear from the context in this passage, and there's lots of others too, that is referring to the heavenly bodies that are up in the sky. But at the same time, that phrase, the heavenly host, also can refer, and frequently does just as often, to angelic beings as a sort of conglomerate group. There's tons and tons of examples of this. One of them I'll just read, 1 Kings 22:19. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by on his right hand and upon his left. So these two concepts in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, the ideas of the stars and the idea of the angelic being, they're linked together. You cannot pull these two apart. All right, we, as modern people, we tend to separate the material order and the spiritual order, and we keep these things apart. The material order is stuff that you can put your hands on. It's tangible. It's tactile. You can feel it. You can touch it. That's the material order. Okay? And the spiritual order is something else entirely. It's the world of the spirit that's immaterial, that's interior, and we keep these things separate. Well, that's not how anybody in the ancient world understood the cosmos in reality. It's certainly not how the scriptures themselves present the nature of the cosmos either. Rather, these things, the material and the spiritual created orders, were both tied together. Okay? And the spiritual created order is that which stood behind, upheld, stands behind, upholds, governs the material created order. And this is particularly so with reference to the stars. It's not that, I want to be clear here, I'm not saying that the ancients believed or that the scriptures were teaching that like the actual the material essence of the stars, which we understand to be burning gases and things like that, that's like the body of the angel. That's not what they believed. But they didn't at the same time separate the stars that they saw from that which stood behind the stars, that which was the spiritual principalities that stood behind them. These things are constantly talked about in the same way in the Old Testament and in the ancient world. Also in our Orthodox tradition, we have nods in this direction, right? The troparion for the nativity of Christ. What does it say? It talks about those who worshiped the stars, were taught by a star to adore you, the Son of Righteousness. It's interesting that it phrases it in the troparion, the Son of Righteousness is S-U-N, the Son of Righteousness. And this is not just something, just to kind of give you a sense that this is not something that before I get there, I'm going to say this. According to this understanding, when we understand the link between the stars and the angelic beings, okay, we understand here, God is promising Abram that his descendants will not only be quantitatively like the stars, he is making a promise that his descendants will also be qualitatively so. They will qualitatively be like the stars. They will become sharers in God's divinity. This is pointing to what 2 Peter says in that epistle, when it talks about how through Christ we become partakers in the divine nature. All right? And again, this is not just something that I'm extrapolating on. This was an interpretation of Genesis chapter 15 that existed before the time of Jesus Christ in the ancient Israelite interpretation in multiple places. It's in a number of different places. The most bluntly described is in Philo of Alexandria. He was a Jewish philosopher whose life straddled the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. He was born about 25 BC and lived past the time of Christ's execution. He lived in Africa. and he published, or he wrote extensively on the book of Genesis and on the Old Testament scriptures. And in two different places, when he's talking about Genesis chapter 15, in this very verse where God calls Abram, he says, look at the stars, so shall your descendants be. Philo, who's not a Christian, notes very specifically, it says, God does not say, so many shall your descendants be. But he points out that God says, so shall your descendants be. In other words, Philo points out that they will become like the stars, is what Philo is saying. So this is an interpreted tradition that predates and that was seen as being resident in this passage before even the time of Christianity. That there were those within Judaism who saw it as pointing in this direction. And so now we are back at humanity's created purpose or end, which I have talked about repeatedly, to be conformed to the likeness of God. That is our created purpose. That is our created end. Though humanity has fallen away from that in the garden and continued in rebellion against God, the flood, the line of Cain, the tower, God's calling of Abram is his beginning the work of bringing about the restoration of humanity and restoring them to their original intended purpose. God's promise to Abram that his descendants will be like the stars is the promise of what we in Orthodoxy refer to as theosis, deification. Okay? This is the end of what salvation is. Theosis, deification, being made by grace what God is by nature. Being brought in to participate in his life, to share in his divinity, to share in and cooperate with him in his administration of and ordering of the whole cosmos. That is the end of what salvation is. C.S. Lewis has probably one of the best quotes that has ever been about this very thing. He says it's a serious thing to live in a society of potential gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person that you bump up against may one day be a creature of the sort such that if you saw it now, you would be tempted to fall down and worship it. That is the end towards which God's intending to bring humanity. The end of theosis, a full participation in the divine life. When I was reading through one of the commentaries that I have in preparation for this, I was reading one in particular, and it was an evangelical commentator. He was really, really good. A lot of really, really good things to say. But when he was talking about the ways in which all the nations will be blessed through Abram, he was talking, of course, about how it was through Jesus Christ. And he was listing the various ways and discussing that Christ was the epitome of this and the fulfillment of this promise. And he says, and of course, the highest way of all, the sum total, the paramount way in which Christ is the fulfillment of blessing to all the nations is that through him we have forgiveness of sins. Forgiveness of sins is a wonderful thing. But I was struck that that's what he saw as just the highest thing, simply the forgiveness of sins. The fact that we could be declared, or have our sins declared forgiven by God. That's not the highest thing at all. That's not the end. That's a great thing. And it's something that is truly, it's a blessing that comes to and is available to all the nations through Jesus Christ. I'm not making light of that. But that's not the end. That's not the telos of where it's all going. It's not where it's all going. It's ultimately going to the restoration of human nature and the deification of human nature and our participation with God in the very rule and order and administration of his created order and being made like him. And that starts here with Abram. And that is where I will end.